Hey everybody, Ty here. I hope everyone is doing well, and depending on where you are, it's already feeling like fall, isn't it? And I figured, since it's feeling like fall for a good chunk of us in the US, why don't we go ahead and take a look at what's next? Because fall technically starts on September 1st, or meteorological fall, I should say. The technical fall season, or the official start of the equinox, is on the 22nd. But since we have meteorological fall beginning at the beginning of next month, we're going to go ahead and talk about it. Now, as I've talked about in plenty of these outlooks in the past and will continue to do so, these are 30 to 90 day averages. This is not telling the story of what every day is going to be like. So take these maps with a grain of salt. Just more or less look out for the trends, because the longer into the range we go, the less certainty we have. And that's a thing with every forecast, no matter who it is. And the pros will always tell you that. So, that being said, let's go ahead and kind of break this down by the percentages here. So, as you can see, we have our above normal temperatures here. There are no below average temperatures on the seasonal map as of right now. This is pretty much the final map that we're going to get for this 3 month period here, because the next update is going to be like September 19th, and we'll pretty much have to move on from this map to October, November, December. So we got what we got here, but who's to say that this map may or may not have its wrinkles here and there. In particular, that's going to be due in large part to the potential for a La Nina to emerge as we get later into fall and into early winter. So this, what you're seeing on this map, is not going to be the same as we get towards, let's say, late October into November. I think those 2 months in particular are going to be quite wide open to change here. But what we do have here is, as I mentioned before, that change from neutral Enzo into a La Nina. And for those of you that don't know, basically the Enzo region, or the El Nino region, as a lot of you might think of it as, is the teleconnection that it's one of the teleconnections that can heavily affect our weather during the season. The waters over the Pacific often are connected to one of the jet streams, the subtropical jet, which sometimes can impact our weather throughout the course of a season. It's not quite as prominent during the summertime, especially when you have a neutral Enzo, but when you get towards fall and winter, being in an El Nino or La Nina phase can have pretty significant impacts here, especially if you were to look at this diagram here. If you look over towards the northwest, we end up being a little bit cooler and wetter. This often will lead to increased snowfall potential there. Then you kind of have a little bit of a dry area over here towards the southwest. Then over towards the deep south, you have a little bit of a battle zone here. It could be drier or warmer depending on which state you're in or which part of the topography even. Northern states usually tend to be a little bit colder during a La Nina winter. And usually this is a template for what we'll see in fall as well. So this is always something that we have to keep an extra close eye on. We usually will have the polar jet stream, the northern jet stream, being the dominant feature across the U.S. here, but more often than not, even though it depends on other parameters, how far that jet stream dips could be a key factor in who gets what kind of precipitation at this point. So again, looking at this map, and especially if we were to shift into that next 3 month phase here, this is going to start to look considerably different as we go forward. But at least for these 3 months here, the northeast and the southwest are going to be the areas that we'll be watching for the best chance for above average temperatures. Some of those days could be significant considering the fact that we have the 60 to 70 percentile range here. So at times we could be dealing with days that could potentially be 20 plus degrees above average, but that's not going to be what every day is going to be like, as I've mentioned before. This is just a general idea of some of the peaks that we could be seeing here. It's not really highlighting how many valleys we could have in regards to our temperatures as well. And then the same thing kind of goes when we get to this 50 to 60 percentile range here with this reddish orange color here. I think the temperatures will be a little bit lower. There could be some days where we push 20 above average, but for the most part, I think we would be about 10 to 15 above average, a little bit more regularly. And then about maybe 5 to 15 degrees above average in the orange color here. Things really kind of get interesting once we get into this lighter shade of orange here. This is where we get to that 33 to 40 percentile. A little less certainty here, and then of course where we have the equal chances here, you could go either way with this. But do not be surprised if you have some days below average if you're in this region here. It could easily go one way or the other. Again, this is over a 90-day range, so there's a lot of time for things to kind of go the other way. And those little sub features that aren't going to always be featured in the long range forecast could sneak their way in, and this line could end up actually pushing a little bit further south or even staying further north. So again, something to keep an eye out for as we get into the long range here. Any minute change, especially within the last 2 months of this time frame, could turn that whole map upside down basically. Now this right here is really what kind of interests me, is the precip map, because once we get into a La Nina pattern, this is a little bit more of a calling card that I'm used to seeing, and most meteorologists will tell you the same thing. You start to see the moisture during this time of year begin to be introduced into the northwest here, so not really surprising to see this at all. Deep south, we're still seeing a bit of moisture hanging out over here, but it may start to be a little bit more fluctuant. It may come and go a little bit more. Over these last few weeks over towards the deep south, we've been pretty consistent with the afternoon showers and thunderstorms here, and I would expect that to continue through the first half. But once we get towards the second half, I might expect a little bit of a drop off there. Over towards the southwest, and this is very typical of a La Nina phase, is where we start to see things kind of really dry out over here. We've been seeing a little bit of action from the monsoon over here, but it does look like things are beginning to drop off from this point, and I would expect that to continue. Now, a little bit of a head scratcher here is going to be Alaska, based off the 3-month average. A lot of activity is expected over towards the western half of the state, but as we get towards the eastern half and the southern part, we're kind of sitting at either or. We have equal chances at this point, so it could go either way. There's not really a whole lot of confidence to be had there, but depending on the jet stream, we could see an increase in moisture here, and it only could actually stretch this out a bit more. But I would expect for the most part to see areas like Seattle getting into the mix here in regards to increased precip here. So especially as that jet stream begins to dip, I expect the probabilities to actually go up as we get towards the back half of the season. So let's quickly jump over to the October, November, and December. And already, if I were to go back to the last frame that you were seeing here, which was showing the previous 3-month period, you'll notice quickly that that equal chance line has kind of dropped a little bit to the south here. I'll show you again. This was September, October, November. Now look at this. So that's one of our telltale signs here that the La Nina pattern shift is beginning to take shape at this point. And as a result, we've seen a little bit of a drop off here, with that potential for the jet stream to begin to push south here a little bit more in the way of troughing to come in as well. So as a result, we've seen a little bit of a drop off in temperatures into the northeast. I do think there's a couple of other teleconnections that come into play here, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit actually. But as a result, we're still going to be above average here. But as a result, though, I think we'll see more along the lines, maybe more days where we're 10 to 15 degrees above average for the most part. Now, keep in mind, again, 90-day average, not going to really tell the story of every day, but if I were a betting man to go off of numbers, that's what I would say at this point. You can even see a little bit of a drop off over here towards Florida for a little bit. Now, there are a couple of other features that we'll talk about a little bit later in the video as to why I think that's going to be what it is over here. But the one common denominator between both of these maps is that even though it's also dropped off over here towards the southwest, we're still expecting mostly above average temperatures by a relatively notable percentage over here towards the southwest. So the things I'm going to be paying attention to in particular, of course, the northern states, where we would expect a little bit more of a drop off in temps as we go further into the fall. And then over here for moisture, I would definitely say the northwest. Northeast could also be a point of interest, and then over towards the Midwestern and Ohio states we'll be watching probably for moisture as well. And we kind of nailed that here really just without even looking at this outlook map. It kind of almost matches exactly what we were talking about here. Here's that La Nina map here, and then if we were to go back, look at that. Almost a perfect match as to what we were seeing earlier. And then notice, just like we were talking about earlier with that thunderstorm and pretty much afternoon shower pattern that we were talking about towards the eastern half of the state starting to drop off, we're starting to see more drier or below average precip starting to sneak in here. Again, this is just a trend that we're looking at off of a 3-month average. Not every day is going to be dry. Not every day is going to have significant rain chances if you're in the green. So you have to take this again with a grain of salt. But from what I'm seeing here, there's going to be a notable change as we get towards the back half of fall. So let's go ahead now and look at those other two teleconnections that are a key factor in this. And for those of you that have been watching the channel for a while, you know which two these are. We're looking at the Arctic Oscillation up here towards the North Pole and the North Atlantic Oscillation over towards Greenland and Iceland here. So for September predominantly, we're expecting a positive phase amongst both. At times we're in like a waning bit of a negative phase here, and I think this is where we start to see that introduction of cold air trying to work its way further south. But because of the lack of pressure over here towards the AO, we're going to actually have more opportunities for warm air to kind of dominate for a bit here. But by the time we get towards the back half of the season, notice that we see a big shift here where we see this big push of cold air beginning to come into play as well. So as a result, this is where those northern states start to come into play. Now, yes, this is in December, and this is based off the average here. But if we were to look at November, notice that we see a little bit of a push here as well, both towards the AO and the NAO. It's not predominantly all a warm air mass. There's an increase in pressure right here. And whenever we see that increase in pressure, we start to see more bit of cooler temperatures beginning to come into the picture for the northern states. Now, obviously, at this point, it's no way to really tell if we can get this to go further south or not. So, like I said, this forecast, I would say, or this outlook is still very much wide open. So, we're going to have to be extra watchful. So, I urge you to definitely keep that notification bell on for those monthly outlooks that I'll be doing. We'll have one coming at the end of the month for this upcoming month. But once we get to that point and beyond here, it's when things really seem like they're going to start to get interesting. But another thing that I'm going to be also watching for is this region over here towards the Aleutians. I'm always on watch during this time of year, in particular for any sort of stratospheric heating, because the two words that everyone dreads is polar vortex, and I'm not seeing a strong signal that will lead me to think that that could be a thing as of right now. But it is something that we're going to have to keep an eye out for in the trends here, especially as we go into the long range. We'll talk about that more particularly once we get into our first winter outlook, which will probably be like a month or two from now. But at least for now, we're in a setup where it looks like we're going to be kind of flip-flopping the further along we get into fall, which isn't all that uncommon, truthfully. Nothing to really be concerned about, but definitely something that we need to be paying a little bit closer attention to. Alright, so I guess now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take a look at what the jet stream could look like over the lower 48 as well. And this kind of backs up the claim that I made a little bit earlier about this being zonal. And this, as a result, seeing a decrease in a bit of precipitation across the board here. As we're in that transition from the neutral phase into the La Nina phase, typically this area gets a little bit drier, and as we transition from September into October and then November, we kind of see that a little bit more. We do begin to see just a tiny sign of troughing here based off these contour lines we're seeing maybe over towards the Midwestern and Ohio Valley states. But right now, I don't have a whole lot of confidence based off of that look. Keep in mind, again, we're looking at a 30-day average on this particular model run. So, again, not really able to tell the full story based off of day by day or even week by week. So, can't really put a whole lot of merit into this right now. And then as we get into the end of fall and into the start of winter, this is where we start to see that cold air mass beginning to set up shop here. So how this affects our temperatures ultimately is going to be really interesting. September seems like it's going to be a relatively average month. If you're over towards the deep south, again over towards the northeast, it seems like we're going to have the greatest probability of above average temperatures. At times we could potentially see about 15 to 20 degrees above average. Over towards these areas in the southwest, it's not quite as bad as I thought it would be. I would say 15 to 20 would have been the average here, but we're actually looking like we're going to be more 10 to 15 here. So that could be a little wrinkle right there already in its own right here. As we go further along here, you can see the temperatures kind of dropping off a little bit. We're starting to see more of those 5 to 10 degrees above average here. And again, this is kind of a little bit of a discrepancy between the outlook and the model data that we have here, because this is the most recent model that we have available to us. This was updated earlier this morning. These update like every 6 to 12 hours here. But from what I can see, it's been a couple days since this came out. But if we were to go to this was updated earlier today. And now it's kind of favoring California, showing maybe about 10 to 15 degrees above average there. So it's another one of those little wrinkles as well. So we get towards November. If you were to look back at this again, we jump back, you can actually see the high pressure setting up over here towards the western states. So classic case of another teleconnection, a positive PNA where it's warm out west, cool out towards the east. You can see where that ridge is strongest, where the warm air mass is most dominant, is where we're going to have those above average temperatures. And it's at this point where we start to see a major increase in temperatures over towards Wyoming in particular. And it's here where we could potentially see about almost 10 to 15 degrees, maybe even 20 degrees above average there. By the time we get towards the end of the season, look at that cold air mass that's starting to come in, and how we've pretty much set ourselves up into a classic La Nina style setup. So, like I said, a lot of wrinkles to be had in this as we get later into the season, and there are a lot of intricacies that could make or break the season as well. So, a pretty big margin for error here. So we got one more teleconnection that I'm going to talk about here, and then we'll probably go ahead and take a look at our precip maps and go from there. And this teleconnection is one that doesn't quite get talked about as much on the channel. We've been starting to use it a bit more, and it's been kind of helping with accuracy. And that is the Madden-Julian oscillation. It's usually centered around the equator, and there's two phases that we look for. This phase here in the green is the enhanced rainfall phase, and this is kind of the drier phase right here in the brown. So if you're figuring that wherever we see that increased, that area of green, that or the enhanced rainfall phase, you can expect more along the lines of increased precipitation potential. The reason why we're showing this in the world view right now is to show you two things. Not only its movement, but we have to remember hurricane season goes throughout fall. So the things that we're going to be paying attention to in particular, even though these other parts matter as well, is over towards the Gulf of Mexico, or the Gulf, and then over here towards the main development region here. So what we'll be paying most attention to is this spot over here towards the Gulf. Pretty much throughout this season, all the way up until the end in November, we were in a enhanced rainfall phase. So we always will have to watch this area close to home for the potential of tropical development going forward. Now, an area that we're watching during this time of year, which is common to see tropical storms, hurricanes develop, is the main development region. We are in an enhanced rainfall phase here. The MJO is going to help assist in maybe creating a little bit more in the way of opportunity. This does not guarantee any storms making impact to any land masses whatsoever here. So again, just because you see the enhanced rainfall phase does not mean, oh no, we're going to get hit by a hurricane. If I see that in comps, I'm going to be pissed. Anyway, though, so we go further and further along here. You can see the dry phase begin to come in, and then eventually it just kind of represents the end of the season here, so to speak. If you look really closely, you can actually see the deep south over here in the southeast in a dry phase as well. Not uncommon to see that with a La Nina during this time of year. This is often a battle zone, depending on where the jet stream ultimately sets up, could be a big determining factor as well. But I wouldn't expect much in the way of big storm systems to be rolling through the deep south. If anything, I would be mostly watching over towards those Midwestern and Ohio Valley states again. It seems like a consistent trend once we get towards the back half of fall and maybe into the beginning of winter. So, let's see how well that matches up with what we were just seeing here. So here's September. You can already kind of see a little bit of that evidence coming in from the MJO, La Nina, and all the other factors coming in. And then as we get into October, you start to see a little bit more in the way of consistency there. November, we kind of slow up on the precipitation a bit, unless you're out towards the northwest. But then by the time we get towards the end of season into the start of December, look at that. Look at how it just kind of comes right back. So from what I'm seeing right now, there's a decent bit of model continuity, but there's going to be a lot of more intricate pieces that we're going to be keeping an extra close eye on. So the last thing that I'm going to go over here is we're going to try to see where we end up matching up in regards to our month to month for the Enzo phase here. Now we're going to be looking at 2 months here, and keep in mind we're like right on the edge of being on a weak La Nina. And the last time that we've seen that, as we've gotten into the fall here, we actually have to go back pretty far. This tab actually closed out a little bit earlier than and it really wasn't supposed to, so my apologies there. We'll keep that in the video. But if we actually were to look at a reference for any year within the last, since recorded history began in the 50s, we really don't have much in the way of a weak La Nina that suddenly just kind of pops up here in the middle part. Really, the closest that I've seen has really come around maybe, I would say maybe 2009. And that was an interesting year because I actually remember some of the details of what happened here. I noticed that in late 2008, towards the southeast, there were a couple of weird snow events that we had here, or into early 2009 for winter. But as for the fall itself, we were relatively mild towards my area. So I would expect the southeast to possibly be in the same boat there. But over towards the northeast, it was pretty busy over there. It's a lot more storms that were going through that area. So we'll be putting a little bit more focus on those areas. As far as severe season was concerned, I don't remember a whole lot across the board in regards to the U.S. I think it was kind of slow in 08 and 09. And then out towards the west, it was very busy in regards to winter weather there as well. So it's just really more or less a reference that I'm making. It's not going to determine what we end up seeing, but it's another trend that we'll be keeping an extra close eye on here. That being said, though, I appreciate you all being here. Make sure you hit that like button and that subscribe button. I'm sorry that this one was a long one, but this is basically our final fall outlook here. Be on the lookout for the September outlook, and maybe in the next month or so, we'll even talk about winter. But until then, everybody take care. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you later.